Hello, History 151 class. Welcome to our first review video. These review videos are going to be pretty important, so I certainly suggest that you view them on a weekly basis. I'll be posting one pretty much every week. And it's really just going to be to go over the main questions that I asked in class and review the main assignments that you had, primarily looking at the PowerPoint questions and the primary source document discussions. As opposed to posting a lot of individual feedback on your assignments, this is kind of my way to give perspective to the entire class, answering any questions that might have come up during grading the assignments, as well as adding in just additional perspectives and trying to find some kind of common ground that a lot of people, kind of came to and find some consensus and so forth. So this is going to be one of the main ways that you're going to be getting feedback from me. Now, if you do have a question on a grade that you receive at any point in time, make sure you contact me directly and let me know. If I ever take points off of an assignment, for example, the PowerPoint questions, I'll leave a comment in the description to let you know why that was. The primary source documents are a little bit harder. There's not a great spot for me to leave direct feedback if I'm going to be taking points off. So once more, if you see that you're missing points, make sure to contact me and let me know, and I can tell you exactly why those points have been taken off. But as long as you get full credit, it's still a good idea to come back and check out the review video, because a lot of times I'll be giving some extra perspective on a lot of these questions, as well as kind of reviewing some of the things we might have talked about in the past and looking ahead, kind of setting the stage for some of the things that we're going to be learning in the future. So very much highly recommended you watch these videos on a weekly basis. Also, before we get going here, just a brief reminder that your answers to all the PowerPoint questions need to be at least 35 words in length. Otherwise, you are not going to receive any credit for your answer. So make sure that you are taking the time to craft answers that are at least 35 words in length. For additional requirements, also make sure you're taking a look at the rubrics that I have posted for both the primary source discussions as well as the PowerPoint questions, because those should answer the majority of the questions you might have about how I go about grading these assignments. Okay, moving on then to our first week's PowerPoint questions. PowerPoint question number one: what aspects of Chinese culture worked together in order to make it such a stable and long-lasting civilization? A lot of you did a really good job answering this question based upon what I provided you in the PowerPoint or just your own personal knowledge you already had. And certainly the kind of discussion on China's success at the beginning goes back to geography. It had a lot of really good geographic advantages. It had a lot of land that was very useful for agriculture, a number of rivers that made irrigation possible very early on. It was also, very relatively temperate climate throughout most of the country, and it was in some cases kind of isolated from other populations around it, to kind of let it develop without too much interference from outside forces. So all this combined to lead to China becoming a rather insulated but very large population as it began to develop through time. And this large population was, I'd say, is another really big key to China's success. You got to remember, in the pre-industrial world, really the only way that you could go about increasing production or increasing the productivity of an empire or a country or a kingdom was to increase population. There really wasn't a whole lot of other methods in order to accomplish that. So a lot of the success that you see in China, the vibrant trade, the kind of hallmarks that we think of civilization that developed there, are partially due to just the incredibly large population that it had, creating just a lot of trade, diversity, and connectivity within the country itself, but also allowing then there to be contact with outside countries and locations and peoples to connect with. Another really important aspect of China, and one I don't think that could be really overstated, was this idea of the mandate of heaven, which I mentioned in the PowerPoint. And pretty much this was China's way of solving the issue of succession. How do you transfer power from one leader or one dynasty or one ruler to the next and ensure that there's going to be some sort of stability and continuation within the government or within the country And this really is one of the biggest problems that empires have had throughout history. And very few seem to ever really get a real stable succession practice down. Sometimes everything is supposed to go to the oldest son. That's kind of what is developed in medieval Europe, that idea of primogeniture. But that's kind of the exception. A lot of times, succession was supposed to stay in the family of an empire, but it wasn't real clear as far as who that would be. So it might be one of a number of a ruler or an emperor's sons, and they'd kind of have to fight it out to determine who is going to be the next ruler. It might be acceptable for it to be a king's brother or cousin or someone else just kind of within that lineage. Once more, a lot of times this led to a lot of infighting and conflict. There's a number of other succession practices that have developed throughout time, but the most important aspect of the Chinese succession practice was this idea of the mandate of heaven. And pretty much the mandate of heaven simply stated that as long as things were going well, the emperor pretty much deserved the respect and loyalty of the country, the nation, and everyone around him. Once things started going poorly, however, that kind of showed that the emperor had lost the will of the gods, so to speak, and that was unacceptable for people to rise up and try to fight against them and overthrow them. And if someone was successful in doing this, this is the most important part, the rest of the country was supposed to kind of rally around that individual and kind of make sure that it was going to be business as usual moving forward. So certainly there were succession disputes within China. There were, in some cases, outside invaders coming into China. But through all this, the mandate of heaven pretty much led to a stable succession of power from one dynasty to another, from one king to another, from one ruling group of people to another, where the country was very quickly able to kind of recoalesce around a new leader or no new ruler, without oftentimes long sustained periods of turmoil, civil war, and destruction, which oftentimes accompanied succession disputes in other countries. Going along with this and really reinforcing the entire system was this idea of Confucianism, as well as the kind of Mandarin class. Entirely as essentially, this is kind of an entire bureaucratic class, which other civilizations and empires had, but the Chinese really took it to a new level. They really focused and stressed education, particularly education towards serving the state. They had a very intense examination process for people who wanted to be these kind of civil servants. And it was actually, in some cases, a way of kind of upward mobility for a lot of people who would be able to rise up within China. But the underlying current of all of this was to maintain these kind of relationships within China that kept it so stable. The relationship of kind of honor and respect, but within the family, between one brother and another brother, between a father and his son, between a ruler and the people that he's ruling, between the people and maybe a governor of whatever province they're in, with the underlying kind of idea that if everyone fulfilled their kind of obligations within society correctly, that it would only benefit everyone, and those people would then be kind of rewarded and promoted and viewed as kind of a person of high status within this society. And this was really enforced, enhanced, and perpetuated throughout the years, and always kind of backed up whoever that new incoming ruler was going to be, supporting that idea of the mandate of heaven and a continuation of Chinese culture. And really, for this reason, China always became kind of one of the most stable locations in the world. That's why it eventually becomes such a vibrant trading location. Not just because there's this huge population that's creating tons of surplus goods and food and so forth to be traded, but also because it was always going to be a more or less stable trading partner for the peoples around it, which would only in turn go to reinforce kind of the stability and the wealth and the power, quite honestly, that China was going to hold. So that's one of the reasons why it was really one of the kind of most long-lasting and impressive geographic locations that we saw up until this point in time. All right, PowerPoint question number 2. Why do you think trade and contact with other cultures is so important in the development of large civilizations? A lot of you did, once more, a really good job of pointing out the importance of transfer of goods, of food, of technology. from one civilization to the other, essentially allowing people within those civilizations to get the items, the goods, and so forth that they needed. It enriched people usually and oftentimes within both civilizations or both empires or countries that were trading with one another. One of the most important things which ends up getting traded in this is food items and food processes, as well as the technology to implement them. And we really see a lot of times when there is a population spike within an empire, a lot of times it is due in part to new food being introduced via trade, or new agricultural techniques or technology being introduced via trade, and that ultimately allows the country to grow a lot more food, a different kind of food that can support a larger and larger population. So as you see global population levels rising, a lot of times it's in due in part to this transfer of food, crops, and technology from one location to the other. This is true in the time period we're talking about here, up to 1500, and that only becomes more true looking forward into our class. We're going to talk in the upcoming weeks about the Columbian Exchange. And in a lot of ways, the incredibly large population of the world today is entirely dependent upon that trading process that goes on and the ability to plant crops that were once only in the Western Hemisphere into the Eastern Hemisphere and vice versa, which once more you can see the global population take a huge jump after that time period of the Columbian Exchange. Of course, also equally as important is the exchange of ideas and ideologies between these various countries. You saw lots of examples in the first half of this class, up to 1500, of how religious ideas in one location seem to spark and influence and enhance the religious ideas and the ideologies in a different location. Same thing with political ideas and political ideologies. We'll be seeing how important that becomes in the second half of our course. Um, People also pointed out, did a really good job of explaining how if you are trading with your neighbors, you're much more likely to have a positive relationship with them. If mutually beneficial trade is occurring, both sides are going to be a lot less hesitant to engage in warfare with one another. They're going to try to keep that mutually beneficial trade relationships going and sustained. So it can, in a lot of ways, kind of be a stabilizing factor between large civilizations. All right, so why do you think Europe was a relatively small and poor player in the world at this point in time? First of all, Europe had just become very decentralized since the collapse of the Roman Empire. Of course, during the times of the Roman Empire, which in a lot of cases should be seen more as a Mediterranean empire rather than a European empire. Um, but that being said, it was certainly one of the most influential civilizations and populations within Europe. But since the time period that the Roman Empire kind of transitioned into the medieval period as well as the Byzantine Empire, the majority of continental Europe had become very decentralized. It was broken down into a number of smaller population groups, competing kingdoms. The church ends up becoming an incredibly powerful institution, really being one of kind of the only unifying factors within medieval Europe. But internationally, Europe was always very internal looking. It was always kings worried much more about kind of their own kingdoms, their own provinces, their relationships with the church, their relationships with the clergy within their own kingdom, their relationships with their vassals or their retainers, and the people who were working the land. That was always their primary focus. There wasn't a lot of seafaring technology that got left over from the period when the Roman Empire kind of ceased to be the large kind of trading empire that it had once been. Uh, and for the most part, Europe had become very much isolated. This was only really, I'd say, enhanced by the fact that they were relatively intolerant of anyone who was not kind of part of this Western Christian empire. There was a lot of persecution, as I mentioned in the PowerPoint, against people of the Jewish faith. There was a lot of warfare and conflict going on with different Arabic empires, either in Spain, in Sicily, or eventually through the Crusades in kind of the Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean, or I'm sorry, it'd be the Eastern Mediterranean, um, and that really their primary goal oftentimes seem to not be less interested in contact, in trade, and more interested in simply acquisition of land, acquisition of power, and trying to create a holistic Christian society, as opposed to the large trading locations that we talked about, China, India, the Middle East, were much more interested in utilizing the diversity within their countries to further enrich themselves, so to speak. Europe really never got to that point in time. Um, but it's important to note that towards the end of this period and getting into the time period we're going to be talking about, this isolation begins to end. And ultimately, that gives Europe some very big possibilities and opportunities, of which they certainly take advantage of. And a large portion of the first few weeks of our class is going to talk about how Europe kind of goes from this kind of small, kind of almost backwater, if you're talking about kind of economic development and participation in a global sense, to one of the most largest kind of powerful economic centers, as well as military centers, on the planet within only a relatively short amount of time. Uh, but it's important to note that the reasons for their success are oftentimes linked to the ability to finally make these connections through the process of the Crusades, their interactions with the declining Byzantine Empire. There was just enough contact with the outside world to begin to allow some of these pieces of technology, of former knowledge to begin creeping back into Europe. For example, when we start looking next week at the kind of explosion of European exploration, that was really fueled from technology from China, from the Middle East. A lot of the works of literature and history that came into Europe during the time period of the Renaissance was coming from uh, the Arabic empires, the Islamic empires, who had really kind of preserved the knowledge from the Greeks and Romans, and at this point in time were pretty much kind of the world leaders as far as science and technology that had been realized and worked on in some points during the ancient world, and they were only enhancing and extending on that far before Europe kind of reintroduced that. So it was really only through contact with these outside groups that kind of Europe was able to regain something it had really lost. So that idea of contact and trade ultimately becomes very important to Europe ending their isolation. In a lot of cases, um, pushing much farther than anyone would kind of suspected, looking at Europe at the beginning of our time period here. PowerPoint question number 4. Why might the geography of Africa and North America make the creation of large civilizations difficult? I Some of this was present in the PowerPoint. Some of this is just kind of additional knowledge. Um, but pretty much the geography of Africa and North America are just simply not as conducive to the creation of large stratified states as Eurasia is, which is one of the reasons why you see less real large stratified states within those locations. Now, it's important to note that they certainly do exist. You have, for example, empires such as the Mali within Africa, you have the Maya and the Inca within North America, as well as Cahokia. So the creation of large stratified states are certainly possible within Africa and North America. The biggest thing to remember is that they're just typically smaller in size and scope than those within Eurasia. This is due to a number of different reasons. The first is that Africa and North America are much more on a north-south axis. This is important because if you're talking about trade and commerce and contact, particularly remember one of the most important aspects of trade is the exchange of food and agricultural products from one location to another. Um, there's simply not a large geographic area where similar plants are going to grow really well on a north-south axis like there is on an east-west axis. There's a large stretch between the Mediterranean, the Middle East, stretching all the way to China, where very similar plants and crops, because they have a very similar climate, are going to be able to grow relatively well. Whereas if you think about the difference between the weather and the climate, for example, in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, and let's say Florida or South Texas, even though there's a relatively short distance between those locations, the weather and the climate is very, very different, and the kind of crops that are going to grow well in one location are relatively different than the crops that are going to grow well in a different location. So that, to a certain degree, is going to inhibit the ability to kind of just share as well. There's also a lot of geographic diversity within Africa and North America. Lots of jungles, lots of deserts, lots of arid locations, lots of mountainous regions. And what you see happening in both Africa and North America is that people are much more likely to create lifeways based upon the environments that they are finding themselves in, that they're living in. Of course, people do this everywhere, but there seems because there's more diversity within Africa and North America, there's a more diverse group of people who are doing this, which makes it a little bit more difficult to create these large, unified sedentary agricultural societies when you have various groups that are relying on more kind of traditional hunting and gathering practices, relying more on seasonal subsistence practices. For example, maybe you farm during the summer, but then you go out and hunt during the winter. You collect local crops during the spring and the fall and gather them to supplement. So being sedentary part of the year, but being migratory part of the year as well. You see a lot more lifestyles like that occurring within Africa and North America, where kind of the creation of these large civilizations just simply doesn't make sense. There's really no point in creating a population of 10,000 if half of the people are going to starve because there's simply not enough food every single year. Which means that the people within Africa and North America are simply living in the way that makes the most sense given the environments that they are living in. Uh, Also, if you look at the plants that really lead to large sustained agricultural societies, the modern world today is really essentially surviving off of seven or eight main grains. If you think your wheat, your rice, your barley, all of these main grains are all native to Eurasia, to kind of the Western Asia, the Middle East area, to China, the Mediterranean. Those are where those crops are naturally occurring. There are a few examples within the Americas, but far fewer than you saw occurring within North America, meaning that far more groups and populations were able to sustain larger populations simply by having access to crops that were really well suited for domestication and sedentary agriculture. You see a very similar process playing out with animals. There's a lot of, pretty much, there's about five large land animals that are well suited for domestication: the horse, the sheep, the pig, the cow, and the horse. Did I already say horse? Anyways, five large land animals that are very much conducive to agriculture, and they were all located within Eurasia as well. The only land animal within the Americas, for example, that was really well suited for agriculture was the llama. The llama was still kind of had relatively limits in its usefulness beyond kind of its coat and its meat, and also it was relatively geographically isolated to the Americas. Whereas if you think about the spread of the horse within Eurasia, essentially everyone within Europe, in India, China, the Middle East, all of them were able to gain access to the horse and the transportation and all the benefits, the load bearing capacity that came along with that. Whereas it took much longer, if at all, for them to reach continental Africa, and they did not reach North America until sustained contact between the eastern and the western hemisphere was established. So once more, a much larger percentage of land animals are being domesticated within Eurasia as opposed to the Americas, which much more leads to the possibility of much larger, stable civilizations. One more important note to mention here is the presence of diseases. And this at first seems like it's a drawback to the people of Eurasia. Living in close proximity to these large land animals ends up goats. Goats was the other large land animal I was thinking of. Sorry, just popped into my head. Okay. Sorry about that. So, back to what I was saying. The presence of living in close contact with these large land animals um, means that there was a lot of diseases and illnesses that got transferred from these animal populations to human populations because of the close contact between the two. And this ultimately ended up meaning that the populations within Eurasia were much less healthy than those in North America. There was a lot more pestilence, a lot more disease, which created a lot more problems. If you think about sicknesses like the Black Death, which pretty much had a devastating impact from China through the Middle East all the way into Europe. Um, but what goes along and why this ultimately ends up kind of becoming an advantage and certainly has a huge global impact when these populations come into contact with one another is the fact that diseases, essentially, the way a disease works is that it infects a population. The population, a certain percent die off who are susceptible to that disease, but a remainder of them end up building immunities to that disease, meaning that less of them are going to be able to be affected or fall sick to it. So the disease then ends up essentially mutating into a more kind of virulent, aggressive form, which then reinfects that population. The population then, through the same process, builds up immunities to that new disease. The disease then kind of replicates and finds a more nasty form to reinfect the population. And it's kind of this biological arms race that goes on between these illnesses and human populations. If you think about the flu that we have today, it's very similar, right? Every year there's a different flu shot trying to combat a different version of the flu, but the flu that's it, the flu shot doesn't always work, right? Because there's always a different forms of flu out there that's continuously trying to evolve and become better at affecting people and replicating itself. So this process essentially was going on for thousands of years within Eurasia, where people were becoming sick, building up better immunities, and the diseases were getting nastier and nastier as time goes on. Um, that meant that once these populations came into sustained contact between one another, between people within Eurasia and people particularly within the Americas, that you ended up having a devastating impact on those populations within the Americas who did not have any immunity to these now kind of super diseases that they were being introduced to. Once more, we'll be talking much more about this in the next class period, but it's important to note here as that's one of the key differences between the locations of North America and Eurasia. Africa, for the most part, was kind of somewhere in the middle. Even though there were portions of continental Africa that had relatively little contact with the outside world, there was enough trade through North Africa, through East Africa, where a lot of those diseases were able to be passed into African populations, so that when more sustained contact came with other people from Eurasia, it did not have the same devastating impact that it did with those populations of North America. Um, but through all this, it's important to note that the end result, as I said earlier, was that there are relatively fewer large stratified states that develop within the Americas. There certainly are some that do develop, as the slideshow kind of went on to present. But like I said, they were typically smaller in size and in scale, and typically lasted for a relatively shorter amount of time than we saw developing within Eurasia. But that shouldn't be taken as a way to say that the Americas were less civilized than the rest of the world. They were engaging in pretty much the exact same processes and had all the same hallmarks of civilization that we think of when we think of Eurasia. Those are all present within North America. Um, the biggest difference, like I said, was really the amount um, and the scale. And it's also important to note when you're talking about civilizations that bigger doesn't necessarily mean better at any case in time. And that I think is also something to keep in mind, that the populations of North America, for example, were oftentimes had much less social stratification. There were much more equality. Um, the people in general seem to have been happier sometimes than in locations in Europe or in Eurasia. There was less examples of large-scale warfare within the Americas than there was within Eurasia. Um, so that there's entirely possible that kind of the quality of life in general could have been better there. So it's important to keep those things in mind when we're talking about kind of comparisons of civilization, that bigger doesn't always necessarily mean better, and that there's a lot of things you want to think about when you're looking at how these civilizations are developing and what they mean. All right. Finally, just kind of this question is just kind of one of the things for fun. No right or wrong answer here, but just if you had to choose to live in one of the civilizations we have discussed so far, which would it be and why? Once more, Lively did a really good job of just kind of explaining why you chose the location you did. If, a lot of you chose kind of the stability and the wealth of China as being kind of your prime location. Some people like the vibrant trade and connectiveness, the increase and the presence of scientific research in the Middle East and the Islamic empires in India. some people realized, like what I was saying earlier, that bigger is not always better, and so that they preferred kind of the less large state system which had developed within the Americas. Some people also looked at Europe and said, even though it might not have been great at this time period, they realized it was entering into a time of kind of great potential and great growth, and so that is where they would feel comfortable. So, once more, no right or wrong answer, just kind of something fun to think about and contemplate. Well, that's all I have for our review video for this week. Thank you all very much for your time in watching this. And like I said, this is going to be an important process to watch these uh, throughout the semester. And if you have any questions on our discussion here or on your grades or anything else, make sure to contact me and let me know. Thank you all very much.